Welcome everyone in this new video tutorial about the multiplayer combat editor. In this video we're going to learn how to use presence trigger. So what is this? So if you watched the previous video about trigger modifier, presence trigger is just a built-in features of trigger modifier, which is listening to a simple game event, which is people being around your target. So we are going to open up the trigger modifier we created in the previous video. We are going to get rid of the logic we built as an example, but we are not going to get rid of onBinding initialized, which we hardly found in the previous video. If you followed it, and if you haven't followed it, I suggest you follow it before going into that video. So we are going to check the presence trigger right now. Type in assign and go find standard triggers. Go find on targets around update, like this. It gives you an event that tells you what are all the enemies around. So this only works for targets which have a combat manager and actors which have a combat manager. So it's going to tell you how many and who are the enemies, allies and neutral units around you, and it's going to tell you what is the last actor which modified the values. So, and when you compile, it's giving you warnings. Don't worry about this. It's just telling you, it's just warning us that that's by dragging a wire out of that pin, you are not going to be able to modify the group of enemies being passed. You are just going to be able to read the value out of that pin and not modify the original value which was passed as parameter. So no worries about this. So it might look simple like this, but you also have to tell the system, the MCE system, how it is supposed to retrieve these targets. And for that you have to add a box. So I'm just going to type in box. So you'll have to call a round box, right click, type in a round box, and you have three features called create three functions in the feature category, which are called create a round box, detach a round box, and set a round box. And these are all features that are needed to set up that event properly. So create a round box basically creates a sphere trigger around the target of that modifier, and whenever a target enters that box, it's going to trigger that event. Set a round box gives you the possibility to tell the system that you already have a box, so you do not need to create the box. For instance, maybe your player or your enemy already has a box around it, and you can use that box as and that trigger modifier can use your box, so you can call that set around box. And for that, for instance, we are going to add to our third-person character at the event where we are adding our trigger modifier. And that's a little bit tricky here. So we are just going to do that in our trigger modifier. So we need to tell our character that it has a box around it. And why did I'm just going to talk a little bit about why do you want to set it rather than create it. That's because most of the time you will already have some boxes around your stuff, and boxes are expensive, so you want fewer of them. So most of the time, if you have trigger modifier, you are going to, and which have a round box, you are going to prefer to set them rather than create them. And I wanted to show you how you can do that, but in that specific situation, it's hard. By the logic we created, with the logic we created in the previous video, it's a little bit hard to retrieve the trigger modifier we created to tell it what box we have, but we are just going to do it anyway. So let's drag a wire. So let's consider that you created your logic that add a trigger modifier like this. When you call that node, it's giving you a return value. This is the trigger modifier you created. So you can drag a wire out of this and type in set a round box, and it's asking for a sphere component, and you can give it a sphere component reference in there. So let's suppose in your character you have, I added the wrong component. Let's suppose you have an aggro box around your character which is 100 wide. You can tell the trigger modifier you create that their round box is that box, or you could be just creating on a round box in your trigger modifier there. Oops, my bad. So you could be just creating a round box within your trigger modifier. But in our case, for the sake of cheapness, for performance issues, we are setting this here. So our trigger modifier can trigger. I think we are going to print to string there, like that. We're going to hit Control F5, to compile them all. And then, hey, it's not going to trigger. I think if it's not triggering, that's just because of a collision issue. So I'm just going to make sure that the box we added is reacting to our pawn. So what is it's a bug that says that it should react to all overlaps, and it generates overlaps events. Our characters are properly triggering collisions with world dynamics, which our aggro box is. So this should be triggering. We can make sure it actually triggers by creating an overlap event and printing the name of what's being overlapped by our actor character, like this. So you could see. So they are properly printing in this case. So we can delete that. The collisions are working, but oh, that's just because I did not added. Yep. So the first time I tried, the problem was just that I did not hit P to add the trigger modifier we created. So as you can see, it's reading third-person character on your screen, top left screen, when a character enters or leaves the around box. But what do we want to do here? Well, you could be saying, we want to say, for instance, get mod target of, we are going to print how many enemies allies are around, for instance. So enemies, length we're just going to print that just to see how it works. Maybe if I change theme while within the box, maybe it won't work, we'll see. So if I hit play, hit P, it's going to tell me that I have 0 objects around me. And then if I switch theme, it's not being updated as long as I'm not re-entering the fray, re-entering the box. And I think that's just because I need to refresh. Maybe I need to bind myself to the switch theme event and refresh myself, refresh the aggro when the owner of the box modify its theme. But I think that's an extreme case that should not happen frequently, but we never know. So I will be fixing this. So this is basically triggering when something gets in or out of range. And you have a lot of ways to use this. Oftentimes, I'm not using directly, I'm not building this logic directly in trigger modifiers because trigger modifiers are mostly just listeners. They just provide these events, but they are not providing any other built-in features compared to passive skills and statuses. So I'm often using passive skills and statuses instead of trigger modifiers. And if we were to think about what to do with trigger mod, if you want to know, if you want to have other examples of what you can do with trigger modifiers, you can check out some of the skills created in the examples contents, some of the passive skills. They are all using some sort of trigger modifiers. So if you open them up, for instance, Deadly Dance is creating a trigger modifier and it's binding itself to on-kill, and it's refreshing all cooldowns when you get a kill. Fleetfoot is binding itself to when you are moving, and it's increasing your health regeneration when you are moving. Frenzy says when you get below 50% health, you get frenzied, which increases your damage output, and you trigger the cooldown of your skill. Juggernaut says, so that was the one I was looking for initially. So Juggernaut says, add a trigger modifier, create an around box, and then add a stat modifier, which is a damage reduction, and then bind yourself to on target around update. And then when a target around gets updated, we get the number of enemies around us. We say we multiply this by minus 0.25 with the minimum of minus 0.75, and we say you take that amount of you take less damage based on the amount of enemies around us. 0.25 damage per enemy, up to 75 reduction, basically. And you also have a lot of a rocket jump example and a life steal example. So this is how you can react to the build a presence trigger logic. So it's going to wrap up the video. Hope you guys enjoyed it and hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.